Hi, you're watching DNA Today, a multi-award-winning genetics podcast where we explore everything to do with genetics, from CRISPR to rare diseases to new research. We have won the Science and Medicine Podcast Award for many years now. We have hundreds of episodes, and we really hope you enjoy these conversations where we dive into so many genetic concepts. I'm Kira Deneen, a certified genetic counselor, and your host. Joining me now is Madeline Ashby, who is an author among many other creative roles and talents. Her work has appeared in BoingBoing, Slate, MIT Technology Review, Wired, The Atlantic, and many, many other notable places. She penned a trilogy of novels starting with VN, the First Machine Dynasty, along with other books. And here's my favorite role she has had. She is a writer on my all-time, you can tell how excited I am, my all-time favorite science fiction podcast, Orphan Black, The Next Chapter. For those that don't know Orphan Black, first of all, you're missing out. This is also my favorite TV show, as well as my favorite fiction podcast. So it started out as a TV show in 2013. It ran for 5 years. It's a thought-provoking sci-fi thriller that explores the world of clones. The main character, Sarah, runs into someone who looks like her twin, and then she later finds out she's actually her clone. So the story takes off from there, of Sarah discovering that she's just one of many genetically identical clones, each with their own unique personality and skills. And I love all of them for different reasons. And so the story of the TV show into the podcast, they're navigating a treacherous web of deceit, corporate intrigue, and scientific experimentation, which obviously is my favorite part. So if you know me at all, listeners, you know this is totally my kind of show. And so when I was listening to especially the podcast, I was like, I really hope someday I can interview someone from the podcast. And hey, here Madeline and I are. So thank you so much for coming on. I am just geeking out.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. It was lovely to hear from you.
Yeah, it probably felt a little random, right? Like
It, wa-
this
it
genetics
was a little random.
podcast. Yeah.
It was a little random. It was a little random, but I'm always like really happy when someone gets in touch based on Orphan Black, because it has had like these really long legs in terms of, and a really long tail in terms of how long that people are still discovering the show, and like are still finding out what it's about. And like, it's always a very pleasant surprise when someone gets in touch with you about work that isn't like being promoted right now.
Right.
It's
You're
like,
like,
oh
oh, I
wow,
haven't had
it
someone
didn't
reach
just
out
go
about this.
nowhere. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And so in this conversation, we're going to explore a lot of the genetic concepts that are explored in the
Yes.
show. Obviously, we can't explore all of them because we would be here for days, I think. I mean, there's
Yeah.
so many episodes between the TV
Yes.
show and the podcast. But I think my first question is one that I heard, or one that I thought of when I first heard that the podcast was announced. What
Mm.
was the motivation to continue the Orphan Black story? Because the TV show kind of wrapped it up in a way that, which I also want to mention, there are going to be spoilers for the TV show and the podcast. We have not had any so far, so I'm glad I got that in there. Just too excited. So it wrapped it up in a way that was like, there's still some to be explored, but a lot of plot points were wrapped up. So it felt like a nice balance of where the TV show ended. So what led to conversations of let's revive this as a podcast and continue the story?
I honestly, I feel as though I knew the answer to this, but I don't remember it. In that, the brainchild, like it was the brainchild really of Malka Older, Malka, uh, uh, who just put out The Mimicking of Known Successes. Actually, um, it was her idea, and she and at the time Serial Box, but now Realm Media, sort of got together, and she sort of came in with an idea, and like had this concept for that first season, and really wanted to go for it. And she was a huge fan of the show, as I recall. And then I got a sort of random email from Leah Shama, who's now over at Audible, um, saying, hey, like, would you be interested in writing for Orphan Black? And it was just kind of a cold email. Like, or not cold in a mean way, like a cold call kind of
Right,
email,
right.
like out of the blue, kind of random. And I at first thought, like, why are they asking me? But um because it's sort of like I wasn't even aware that like these people knew I existed. So it was sort of one of
It's a
those
nice
moments.
little ego boost,
It
right?
was,
Like they're
yeah, it
reaching
was a
out to
surprise.
you.
I was sort of looking over my shoulder, like, do you mean somebody else standing behind me? Like, and but I at the like I was known for near future science fiction, sort of technically grounded science fiction, having a strategic foresight degree, you know, writing things sort of in that wheelhouse. And also I live in Toronto, where the show is set and where the show was filmed. And so I thought like, oh, okay, they just want like local talent. They want local flavor. And in fact, like Helly Kennedy, who's also one of our writers on the show, on the podcast, had been a writer on the show and a producer on the show, had written the graphic novels, and then had also, she now writes for Ubisoft, but she's a writer at Ubisoft. So she like brought a huge amount of depth in terms of experience and research and like a real understanding of the characters and a real
And
understanding,
continuity, I
yeah,
imagine
real
too.
continuity, and like knew right off the bat like how to, you know, weave certain aspects in and things like that, and really just, you know, so it was very much a team effort. And I was sort of the one sort of always asking for, um I consistently asked for like more humor and more sex probably,
You guys did
and
great with both.
more uh probably more Canadianisms, like more Canadian things, because like I think when the show starts they don't really acknowledge that it takes place in Toronto right away. um I think it takes until like season 3 or 4 before you see Canadian money, and that was sort of confirmation. There are all these like little in jokes. For example, like the neighborhood that one of the characters lives in is called Bailey Downs. Bailey Downs is a place that is a fake neighborhood from the Ginger Snaps movies, and
Oh.
Tatiana Maslany was in Ginger Snaps too,
Oh,
as
interesting. So
as
it's
a
a
very
nod to that.
beginning.
So is that where
Yeah, the
Allison lives?
nod, because Graham, I think Graham Mason had been involved with Ginger Snaps, or like it's also like just a made in Canada property, and people are very proud of it. And like, so I think Bailey Downs Productions was involved, and like, so there's this I'm trying to remember my cinematic lineage here, but
Right. I
but
won't know.
it was there were these little things,
Like Easter
uh,
eggs almost.
there are little Easter eggs that like kind of almost like only Canadians would get, and stuff that I wanted more of. I just like wanted as many of those as I could
Yes.
possibly get.
Yes. Well, and I think also what makes the beginning of the TV show, like the main character and her foster mother and brother all have British accents. So when
Yes.
I started,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, we're in the UK
Oh,
somewhere.
yeah.
And then you kind of figure out, you're like, well, yeah, but they're the only ones that have that accent, you know,
Yes. Yeah.
and I think having most of the clones have their own, I mean, we all have our own accents, right? Like obviously like our accents are different, you know, just being different humans, but that everybody, a lot of them have different cultures that they grew up in and just different accents from that. So I think just
Hmm.
that is very
Hmm.
interesting. And that's what
Hmm.
led, I think, it to be a really good podcast adaptation, because
Yes.
Tatiana can do all of these amazing accents along with you know, her co-actors. And you
Yes.
guys were able to get Tatiana and a couple of the other actors from the
Yes.
TV show reprise their roles in season 2, which I like didn't expect. I hit
We
play on season 2. I was like, whoa.
we had known that it was possible, that there were talks. We were aware that there were some talks, and then by the end of the first season, like Jordan, I think, like came back for like a little hit, like a little cameo. And Jordan is such a fan favorite, and
Oh, he's great. He
Jordan
plays
Barrett's,
Felix
and
for those that don't remember.
he,
Yeah.
yeah, he plays Sarah's brother, and he's just like, he's so great. And um and the whole cast is really good. Like, there's a real thing that happens when you're writing for something like this, where you know that Tatiana Maslany is going to be reading your dialogue and reading what you wrote, where it's like you're writing for an award winner. Like,
Yeah.
you have to raise your game in a huge way. Like, it really made me conscious of like how I tend to read my work aloud, to myself and to other people, to sort of test it out, like as I'm sort of doing a scene. Even as a child, I used to like say stories out loud to myself. I would sort of rehearse them before I wrote them down. They had to like sound right for me. But it is a very different responsibility when you know that somebody else is going to be performing them and stuff. So you really have to really think about how that's going to come out. And so you really raise your game and you really start to think about how you can you actually hear the different voices? Can you do it the way that, can you hear it the way that it will be said, or how you think it'll be said? Because there's going to be multiple takes, but like, can you write it the way that it's going to come, that it might come out? And that's where, again, like leaving more pauses for humor, leaving more pauses for the audience to kind of catch up, and like, especially with, very complex scientific information, like often introducing the audience to concepts that they might not be familiar with in the everyday. You do
Yeah.
kind of have to leave that space for them to, for that to kind of come through, and make sure that that it's being explained as accurately as possible, but also in a way that is actually heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And I think anybody in science communication has that same concern. Like, I think those are very similar concerns, whether you're in fiction or whether you're presenting a paper or a poster or, you know, doing an interview or what have you. I think, like, or even just like writing the abstract. It's like,
Yeah.
how much, like, this is in all likelihood the only thing that the majority of people will see. How do I put in the most valuable and accurate, but also the most um, eye-catching, or the simplest way of
Being so
getting it
succinct.
across? Yeah, can I do this in the most succinct, helpful? How can I do this in a helpful way, almost?
Right.
And that's, I think, a concern that both that that science fiction writers and scientists like have in common, is like, how do we get this information out there in a way that people understand?
Yeah.
And
And you guys,
that they get interested in.
hmm, and there's so many genetic controversies, topics, technologies.
Yes.
I mean, I have to
Yes.
say, and it's been a minute since I watched the TV show. I want to
Sure.
watch it for a third time now, but
For
I
sure.
think the podcast, you guys actually, I think, went deeper with the science than the TV show did. And I think
Yeah.
because it was, episodes were like an hour long, right? Like close to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they were, you had a lot of time to develop that, and just the space of it being audio, of like you're explaining it,
Mhm.
and that,
Mhm.
especially the clone Cosima, that is like the, I almost want to say like the version of me, like she's like the scientist out of the group.
Yeah, she's
She's the
the
total nerd one. She's also
yes.
gay. Like I love her. I really see myself
She's
in
the
her.
expositor. She's the
Yeah,
expositor. She's the science communicator
yeah, totally. So
on the
that's me
show.
in this world.
Yes.
But I think it's really impressive how much you guys were able to be science communicators in this role of writing for a science fiction show. But a lot
Mhm.
of what you guys talk about is based on real genetic information, and you're saying, how can we apply this?
Yep. Yep.
So,
We yeah.
yeah, like I think one like on the bioethics side, because I know you love
Hmm.
bioethics, that there's this issue of genetic privacy and the downstream
Yes.
effects of, in this world, biological relatives of the clones. Like,
Yes.
their siblings, a couple of them have children.
Yep.
I mean, how did you guys explore this in the show? Like, how did you take in real world issues of genetic data sharing and different implications of striking that right balance, and say, all right, how are we going to explore that into the show? What was important to you guys?
Well, one, I think, like, we wanted to be really accurate. The show had always been very foresightful and very accurate. The show had always been willing to take on um sort of the second and third and fourth order implications, to use the foresight term, to those implications of any given development or outcome of research. And like, I think that, for example, there's a very early episode of the television series in which uh the clones discover that they are copyrighted material, and that their genetic code is copyrighted, that they don't actually own what makes them them. They don't own their bodies. And like that is such a huge watershed moment, like for them. And it's a huge watershed moment for the ones of them that have children. For Sarah, who has a daughter by the name of Kira, you
Yes,
know, that
fun.
she
Spelled the
actually
same.
that that Kira like doesn't belong to her in the same way that she thought, right? And that it's also such a beautiful metaphor for how women inhabit space and inhabit their
Yeah.
bodies. And it was very prescient in terms of how women would become legal objects, essentially, and where you have rights and where those rights end, and who gets to have them and who gets to be considered a human being. So I think like one of the things that we tried to carry over was one, that accuracy, or that like at least a sense of being current. Like even if we couldn't be 1,000% accurate, we were at least current, and we were introducing topics that you might go look up later and like you
Yeah.
might learn more. Two, we tried to use those topics to start a bigger conversation, as it so often does. Like I think like some of our favorite scenes to write, or at least mine, were, you know, where all the clones are together and they're just hashing it out, and they're just being
Yeah.
intelligent women in a room talking about the implications of today's scientific discoveries. Like it does not get better than that. Like
No, those are
it's
the best
great.
scenes. Yeah.
It's great. And it's like, and you never see it anywhere else on TV or anywhere else. Like where else are you going to see, you know, five different women or more, and their partners and their supportive parents and their supportive you know, friends and family members and community members, like actually having a rigorous conversation about what the implications of these discoveries are and how they make them feel, and like what the future might be, and so on. Like there isn't even a nonfiction show that does that. There
No.
isn't even a nonfiction. There is not even like a chat show or on television that does that. And so I think it really met a need for people that they like, that they weren't aware that they had. I
Yeah.
think, and that's when a show of any kind, and or any piece of art, is doing its best work, is when it's meeting a need that people weren't even aware that they possessed.
It
It's
taps something
suddenly
new in them. Yeah.
and I think that's what's continued to draw people, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And then cherry on top is that Tatiana is playing all these characters.
And
She,
Tatiana is
I mean,
performing like,
I have to get it
you
in
know,
here at some point. I think she's one of the best actor and actresses of our
oh yeah,
generation. I
yeah, no,
mean, she
absolutely,
is just,
yeah,
I love Jennifer Lawrence. Maybe she's
oh
better than
yeah.
her, I mean, she's
It's,
up there.
well,
And
she's,
she's
I
not
mean,
as well known.
I think of Tatiana the way that I think of like, I think she is doing the same things. She is doing things at the same level and the same rigor of somebody like Jeremy Strong from Succession. Like around
Yes.
like when
Oh,
Succession
was
was
fabulous.
was on
Yeah.
air, like there was a huge amount of conversation about how Jeremy Strong is a method actor. The other
Mm-hmm.
actors on set are not method actors. He's trained in a very specific way. He emulates other actors in a very specific way that has frankly like worked out quite well. Like he found the method that works for him,
Yeah.
as any professional does. They find a framework and they go with it until if it stops working, they find another one. And so he found a framework that worked for him and got a ton of attention for it, and rightly so. I mean, like he broke his foot running around in Tom Fords and whatever. But
Yeah.
the what Tatiana was doing was this massively similarly athletic performance of being, you know, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different women, sometimes in the context of a single episode, to the point where they actually, and I learned this in figuring out how I was going to characterize certain characters. Um, you know, they invented new makeup techniques for her. The wet on wet makeup technique was invented so that she could film certain characters all in a row and then do another one that same day, because she was playing against herself.
Right.
So she had a double who she would be interacting with the way most doubles are done on television and in film, where who's a person of a similar build and similar height, so that they can key light accordingly. But it's her interacting with herself, and she has to do all of Allison's lines, all of Sarah's lines,
Sarah,
all of Christina's,
Cosima,
all
yeah,
of Helena's lines, all
Elena.
of everybody, like, and then, the other, the clones that they sort of continue to meet. Crystal's lines. I love Crystal.
Yeah,
Um,
oh,
the
she's a blast. Even like
uh
Vivian of with
and
this
Vivian, and
new
like all
podcast.
these
Yeah.
different, she has to do all these voices, and they had to invent makeup looks, cut hair, uh there were wigs, there were makeup looks, there were costumes for each, and they all had like really clean, like v- clear aesthetic parameters.
Hmm.
And so even that I started to look into as I was writing each of them, just to like remember like where they all were, like, and who they all were and how they would sound and all that. But she's doing this performance that is like at the level of, the deepest, method thing,
Yeah.
uh that is about like being all of these different people and stuff. The closest thing to it was, there was a Toni Collette show called The United States of Terra, which was similar, but it was about somebody with dissociative identity disorder. So it was a very different, the point of the show was different. The conversations around the show were different. Whereas I think, one of the interesting things about Orphan Black is that it's about, you know, seeing all the different, when you meet your clone, you see all the different directions that your life could have gone, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what Freud says in the uncanny, is that like the uncanny double is uncanny and scary to us because it's the familiar defamiliarized. That's what that word
Mm.
is. Uncanny in German is unheimlich, unhomely, unhomelike, unfamiliar. And
Oh,
the uh but what's scary to us about someone who looks like us and isn't us is not just, wait, how did that happen, but also, do they have a better life than I do? You know,
right.
did they
You're,
not screw up? Like it's a sliding doors moment, right? And I think we tried to get into that a lot. And we got into how genetics are not destiny either.
yeah.
It's
Well, I
crazy.
think like nature versus nurture is such a
Yeah,
huge
huge.
part of that, of seeing how all the clones are so different, and kind of like how you think like twins are different. But you
Yes.
could even get
Yeah.
in the level of like, epigenetics of like,
Hmm.
Allison versus Sarah, like they're going to have
Yep.
different exposures over their life that are actually going to have their genetics act differently. And I
Yes.
mean, there's
Yeah.
all
Like,
of these kind of other concepts with it, that it's like,
yep.
it's not necessarily, oh, you're clones, because it's like clones exist, they're called twins, but like, there's another level to that. Like my grandfather was a
There
twin,
are
and like,
other
yeah.
levels and layers where, yeah, like I think what was so compelling about the show was that, Sarah meets all these women and they are wildly different to her. And in fact, they are, with, like, I guess maybe with the exception of Helena, but even that is kind of a stretch. Like they are wildly more successful than she is. Like their lives are
Hmm.
a way that hers is
Either
not. And
careers or families or
yeah,
something where they've had a goal they've achieved. Yeah.
yeah, they've achieved more, they've gone further in their careers, they are happier in their relationships, they've adopted kids, they are functional adults, they are self-actualized people, blah blah blah. They are in fact like happy with their lives, like, and that's the thing that this discovery also disrupts, is like, well, wait, how much of this happiness was built on this other thing, which again
Right.
is a very topical, like a very topical conversation. It's a very important conversation about like, well, okay, like what did it take to bring me here? And, and what did I not know? How much of this relied on me not knowing something? And I think that's kind of a gothic, it's a very gothic story because it's essentially about secrets. But that was a thing like that I think a lot of people can recognize, whether, I mean, you don't have to be a clone to suddenly realize that, learning a family secret can really change how you view the rest of your life.
Sure. We've explored that a lot on the show, people realizing a
Right.
relative is not biological or
No.
reverse. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I mean, I think I read a piece years and years ago about how 23andMe had to like have this, like a division almost within the
Yeah.
company that dealt with like people who discovered that their parents were not their parents. in the many different ways that can go, because
Yes.
it's not just
Positive,
one.
negative, neutral. I mean, so many. Yeah.
Yeah. And it can tear people apart. And I think the thing with Orphan Black was that it like got into um it got into some of that at a time when things like 23, like those different services were kind of becoming part of a more global conversation.
Yeah.
And that kind of discovery was happening more and more and more. Like, obviously
Definitely.
it's not the level of I have all these clones running around, but it might be that you have a sibling.
Right.
You might
Some kind
like
of like,
you
oh, they
might
share
have a
half
sibling
your DNA, maybe not
that
100%,
you
but
didn't know about until today. And like, how
yeah.
do you integrate that into your life? Are those
Yeah.
people in your family? What does that mean? That kind of thing. And that's hugely topical. And I think, like, as time progressed, like, people, like, as time went on, I think a lot more people saw that it was like, this is not just about, clones. This is about people. This is
Yeah.
about,
The implications, what can we take
yeah,
out of it?
this has implications for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And one that I was, reflecting on, and actually I listened to the last episode of the podcast today just to kind of get back into the world.
Oh yeah.
And it's interesting because I was like, oh, I just wrote a question about that. But, along with other ethics that you explore, there is this concept, which, spoiler alert again, where characters are vaccinated without them being informed they were
Yes.
clones. So we were
Yeah.
kind of talking about like health implications, that people that are clones in this world have a limited life expectancy. There's a certain illness that takes
Yep.
over, and it's specific to their genetics.
Yep.
So Cosima, the scientist lesbian that I love, her and her partner go on and kind of track down these clones and vaccinate them, and they don't tell them what they're doing. And
Yes.
so they're in this episode, they're on a talk show, and like Canadian broadcast, like big thing. And the host basically asked Cosima, like, well, isn't this kind of related to something like the Tuskegee trials, which I thought I
Right.
just pieced together. You literally had it. I don't know if you wrote that line or someone connecting it. And I was like,
It was
wow, they
us.
went
Like,
there.
it was me. Like, I was always the one, because I had written an earlier episode, and this might have been like leftover from an earlier draft of an earlier episode where Delphine, Casima's partner, says, or her wife, I mean her wife, they're married.
Yes.
Um,
Excitingly.
her wife says something like, we have to be forthcoming about our research, because the history of science is littered with people who have been less than ethical,
Yeah.
and we have to be at the top of transparency, because there are so many reasons for people not to believe us. Like, there are so many reasons. There is, like, we are countering so many narratives. Like, we have to tell the truth all the time, even when the truth is, I don't know.
Right.
Right. And that's the hard part. That's like, that's where you lose investment, right? Like, that's where you lose your Series A funding or whatever. Is, well, you can't say I don't know. That's like, or you can't say that there's going to be no growth, or like whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Because I think we in our writers room were very aware of the fact that, like, that the show had been dealing with those types of stories that exist in history, whether it's the Tuskegee experiments, or
Henrietta
experiment concentration
Lacks and
camps, or like,
yeah.
um you know uh and then even Canada's own legacy of like smallpox blankets, and like, the terrible conditions at residential schools, and like, and things like that, right? And forced sterilizations and stuff like that. So it was really about reckoning with history as it was. I was a history major before I was a futurist, so it was like a very it was I'm used to thinking that way. And so, like, I remember really pushing to, like, include speeches about medical ethics and about, bioethics and genetic ethics, and the ethics of information, because it's data ethics, really.
Yeah. You can pull it back to that point. Yeah.
And stuff. And so, like, we for me, it was really, really important. And so there are, like, I really did want there to be a lot of conversations where people like characters like Cosima kind of had to be called on the carpet a little bit about, like, well, what made you think you knew better than these people?
Yeah.
And
What
how,
brings
and
you above the ethics of
what,
it?
yeah, like, why were you above that? And why did you get to make the decision to leave these women in the dark? They're your sisters too. Like, why did you leave them in the dark? And like, why would you make that choice for people? And that's, I wanted her to not have it easy. I guess like,
Yeah, to
I
struggle with
totally
it.
understood why she did it, but I didn't want it to be easy for her either. I
And
guess.
that's what makes the show so complex, is that there is no right and wrong. And like, that is the crux of bioethics. Like, it is not a clear answer. That's why people are, pulling this out and processing it. But that you can see both sides. You can see Delphine's side,
Yeah.
and you can see
Yeah.
Casima's side, and that Delphine's bringing up points also that she's not a clone. So she's like, what right do I have to be
Yeah. I don't
vaccinating
like,
people? I'm not a clone. I'm not in this
I'm not,
community.
yeah, I'm not in this community. I'm close to it. I've observed it.
For
But I
years.
can't,
Yeah.
but I can't claim, like, I can't claim it. It can claim me. I can't claim it. But you know, it, you either, it was really about like sort of what do you choose to share with people, and at what point is that information advantageous, and like, you're saving somebody's life, yes, but you're also cutting them off from a community. And I think that's like part of what emerges in season 2, is that like there's all these women who suddenly realize that they're not alone. And the reality is that in not telling them, many of them were left vulnerable.
Yeah.
And we started, or I remember pushing for, and I think others along with me pushed for storylines about, you know, women whose partners suddenly turn violent
Yes.
when they like, well, who are you? You're not really my wife. You're not really my girlfriend. You're not really our child, or like, or, you're an abomination, or like some kind
Right.
of very extreme reaction. But also like a very sort of banality of evil moment, where all these women realize that like their mortgage, their job, their credit cards, their like everything that they worked for in life might not legally exist any
Right.
longer, because they weren't who they said they were. Right.
Right. That
And
there's that level of
so,
fraud to it, even though they
yeah.
didn't
And
know
it's like,
that.
well, you've been fraudulent with us. And it's like, my parents were fraudulent with me. Like, that's not my fault.
Right. It's
And stuff.
Dyad's problem, the
Yeah.
the Genetic
This is a
Institute that did all this.
corporation's problem,
Yeah.
and stuff. So it really got into rights, like, rights and protections and consent.
Yeah. Consent was
And
huge. I mean, we
yeah,
talk
and
about that a
that,
lot on the show, informed consent,
yeah, what does that actually mean? And like, can you have those conversations, or how do you start those conversations, often in a culture that frankly doesn't believe in consent,
Yeah.
and stuff. And we talk about this a lot in copyright, right?
Oh,
Where,
definitely.
where there, it's like, you can press forward on that, but the onus is on the copyright holder to press forward, and somehow not on the person asking sometimes. And so, of course, in a culture that doesn't respect consent generally, you're
Right.
gonna get a disrespect of it in every legal context.
Yeah, it seeps into everywhere else.
Yeah,
It's not just in this genetic space, like
right.
it's
Yeah,
almost the base of everything, like
it's
we
in
see in
interaction.
biology.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. And
yeah.
so we really, like, I think one of the charms of working on the show was, or working on the podcast, or the audio drama. There are a million different names for it.
Whatever name we're using in the moment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
on the episodes, the thing that was like really a pleasure working on the story was the opportunity to just like really unpack a lot of stuff. And you might not finish that conversation, but you were definitely going to start it, and you're definitely going to give other people like maybe a way of having that conversation that they wouldn't ordinarily have access to, or language to describe it, or a metaphor for them to kind of think about it. And that's what science fiction in particular is really good at, is like giving people a metaphor to understand something that like might not be addressed in their own home, in their own country, in their own school, you know, especially in places where like now it's like, you can't say gay in Florida. You can't,
Yeah.
like, whatever it is, if your only way of accessing that is to like get at it through metaphor or get at it through simile, you're gonna grab for that, and you're gonna, find a way to have that conversation somehow, I think.
Right. You're going to grasp for whatever you can in that
Yeah.
moment to be understanding it fuller and
Yeah.
everything. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think another thing that I was reflecting on, kind of going off like the vaccines, that makes me think of viruses. Like
Oh yeah.
there was this really interesting plot point in the show, which is probably a phrase I could just keep using, but where this
Yeah.
virus is delivered through these little drones that appear to look like bugs,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
know, to the characters.
Yeah.
And because it's audio, so you're picturing this, you're hearing the
Yeah.
sound effects, it's awesome. But the way it was described is like, okay, they basically, these little drones will like kind of sting people and then
Hmm.
deliver this virus.
Hmm.
And it seems like similar technology to what we have today with like gene drives. I don't know if that's something
Mm.
you came across with research. I mean,
Yep.
how did this concept come to be? What did you pull from real scientific publications?
We were looking a lot at CRISPR, and we were
Hmm.
looking a lot like CRISPR-Cas9, and
And
like we were
you might have even mentioned something, maybe you didn't say
we
it by name, but some kind of genetic editing.
Yeah, like I remember a weekend day when we were all sort of talking together in the writer's room, and I remember saying, like, what if I told you that there was a set of Lego blocks in all of your genes, and you could get the fold out, the Lego guide to all of it.
Yeah.
And if you had the front and the back, like the two bricks on either end, it would let you in to do, and that was the key to everything. Like, and it was literally like we were talking about it at that level. Like, what if there were this thing that
That's
could
so
like,
cool. I haven't
it
heard
was
that
like
analogy. I
a
love
zipper.
that.
And
Yeah.
I think I got it from a piece on the scientists who, the two teams of
Yeah.
scientists who
Jennifer
were,
Doudna and then the other
yes,
team. Yeah.
yeah, who were each working on this, and much like the COVID vaccine, where there were people working on mRNA, and then like suddenly there's everybody hits this massive on ramp,
Yeah.
and and stuff, uh, and so there, I had been paying attention to it, just as someone who was interested in the field, and as someone who comes from a family where there are many cancer survivors and things like that. So it was always of interest to me. I had always been sort of curious about that, and custom genes and gene splicing and like genetic therapy and so on. And I'd been curious about epigenetic trauma and like, um epigenetic expression and things like that, not from like the kind of anti-aging life extension stuff, which is like what we're hearing about a lot now.
Yeah.
There's a lot of startup money for that. I was more intrigued with the idea that like you could see some of these things flip on and flip off in people, based on their experiences, that a lot of what we think of as sort of feelings or invisible disabilities or invisible experiences could be made visible. I really thought that that was fascinating.
Hmm.
And so it had been like an interest of mine, and I think like Malka had the idea of a virus, and then I, like, in talking about CRISPR, I was like, well, like, here's the thing. You know, what this could make possible, or like what some people who are very evil might try to do is target people specifically. And often through a very faulty understanding of what genetics are, right?
Yeah.
And stuff. I had done a lot of work when I was a history major. I did a specialization in Holocaust history. And one of the things that you learn, if you are at all interested in that, is like how a flawed understanding of science like led to the worst abuses ever,
Yeah.
and to crimes against humanity and huge atrocities, because like there was this idea of what a human being was, and what genetics were, and what all those things were, that was fundamentally flawed because it was built on confirming a narrative of identity. and national identity in particular. And so that, like, when I thought about that, I thought about, like, okay, who would use this in the worst possible way, and like what could occur, and how would somebody try to do this, and what would that mean? And then we included stuff like gene drives, like carrying information within the genome, much like a hard drive, because that research was occurring. And like,
Yeah.
I think on the same day, on that same Saturday, like we had this talk where one, it was sort of like, well, what if this happened? And then also, did you know that you can do this? And like, and
It's like,
I
how
showed
can we
them like the
piece all
image
of
of the
this together?
fly and like the,
Sure, the
all the
Drosophila,
classic
yes.
stuff. And it was like, did you know that like you're actually that Johnny Mnemonic in itself is not a lie? Like, it's it doesn't work the way that it's proposed, but it works. And
Right.
here's how. And stuff that like you're actually carrying around this capacity, that you know uh genes do have memory, and not in a you know not in a Joshua Tree, California kind of way, but in a like but in a real demonstrable, measurable way,
Right.
that you have carriage capacity,
Yeah.
and storage capacity within uh
Just like a
within
computer is like 1 and 0, DNA
yeah,
is actually 4 letters. So you imagine you can
you
even do
actually
more with that.
you can do tons more with it, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, using people as sort of data mules that way was a thing that, like, there's been other science fiction written about that. Johnny Mnemonic is, like, obviously, like, a very famous example, but there's been other stories like that. But this time we actually had access to, like, research, and we knew the like, we could adapt some of the language and sort of use it, I don't want to say advisedly, but,
But you're
well,
using it in a way that it's like, okay, this really could happen. Nothing that I
yeah,
was listening to was like, oh, that would never be able to happen, which is a scary thought because you guys really just show like, what if we take these villains basically that are
uh-huh.
using all this genetic technology and all these things that exist? So it's a sobering thought when you
It
think
was
about
very sobering,
this
like,
isn't science
the day
fiction.
that we talked about it, like, the day that, like, because it's like, it's always, like, very, you know, it's all fun and games until somebody gets punched in the face.
Yep.
It's all everybody has a plan until he gets punched in the face, but
Until someone gets cloned.
yeah,
Yeah.
but there was a real, like, no, 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 like, what if it doesn't, like, it was really about, like, this doesn't necessarily have to be possible. If enough people believe that it is, they will act as though it is. And so, like, there was a
Mm,
real, like, maybe it wouldn't work, but um that's not enough. And sort of, there was a very sobering conversation when we talked about, like, the implications of, like, what we were really discussing,
yeah.
and stuff. And that was a very, like, it was, I think it was very cold outside, like, it was snowing, and, like,
Toronto, so it makes
it was
sense.
it was Toronto, and it was like, "No, no, no, this is real, like, these are the implications of the research that is ongoing. We don't know what's possible, but we know, um, it's the sort of science fiction writer and futurist lament of, like, I don't know what's going to happen next, I only know what people do,"
Right.
Like,
Taking that and running with it as a writer.
yeah, it's like, I don't know the future, I know people.
Mm,
And that's kind of where it came from, was like, okay, could we draw a line between, all of these different elements, in terms of research and funding and capital and, like, um interest and all that, and put together something that was very scary, and we it was absolutely extremely easy.
yeah,
Like,
like almost
once
too
yeah,
easy concept wise. I'm sure
almost
once
too
you're
easy.
actually writing it, that's
Yeah,
very
yeah,
difficult because it's
yeah.
one thing to have a storyboard, and you have all these ideas, and then some end up on the cutting room floor, as they say. I hear,
And that's
but
actually I mean, the real task, like, working on this project totally changed how I outline my work now.
interesting.
I learned how to outline, and I had done two master's theses. I'd done two departmental honors projects and two master's projects.
Wow.
And I had done like oral finals for my first 2 years of university education. So like I was no stranger to like long-term projects. But there is nothing like story breaking to teach you how to outline. Like
Yeah.
nothing.
Hour-long
Um,
episodes. What was there, about 10 episodes a season, something like
10
that?
episodes a season.
Yeah.
That season is about 10,000 words per episode.
That's long.
And we cut it down for the next one because we also like had more data about like what people were listening to and like
Right
whatever.
when they were
And
dropping off all the podcast
yeah,
data. Yeah.
or like even just like the uptake or like what feedback had been and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And so like we had a better sense of it the next go round. But in the beginning, it was literally like I would sit with Scrivener and set word count targets for each card, like for each scene in the binder, and put them all together, and like they had to fit within a certain thing, and they all had to be like about the same length so that
Wow.
they weren't, so they weren't too top heavy,
Right.
or too
I would think
heavy.
with podcasting, you'd have a little bit more wiggle room than with a traditional TV show where it's like got to be like 42 minutes ish, or that
You
that
do,
area for
but
commercials
there
and
are still breaks. You're still aware of the
right.
fact there are breaks, and also you're aware of like audience attention spans where like they
Mm,
pause a scene whenever they want, but they might not be able to get back into it as quickly. And so
yeah,
one
you
of
space
the
out for a second. Are you able to get back in or not?
yeah,
Yeah.
are you if you go away and come back, or like you get a phone call, or like
You
get
step
a
out to get the
text, or
laundry and
yeah,
yeah.
the same as commercial breaks
Yeah.
once were, and probably will go back to being again, because that's the only place that any growth in streaming is happening, is at the commercial tier. Uh,
Right.
like and cable pays residuals, so if you want to help actors, get cable back.
Yeah.
Um, the the th- the thing about it was that it formed a nice, like a natural structure, and you had to be really mindful of like how much you were asking of people. And again, like that goes back to sort of the point around science communication of like, okay, how much information have we really asked people to absorb
Right. And you need a character to
in
be
one
like, I
go?
don't understand what's going on. I'm not going to
Yeah.
attempt to do accents, but Sarah in her British accent saying, I don't get this, Casima.
Yeah,
Casima's going off
literally.
high level about CRISPR-Cas9 system and,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah, no,
yeah,
I mean, this is all just so interesting. I want to be mindful of the time, not to take up too much
yeah.
of your time with everything, but
All right.
this has just been so awesome. I was just really
Yes.
looking forward to this. And I had a dream of interviewing you before I even
Oh,
reached
wow.
out. And I was like, I hope.
No, no,
I've followed you on I'll say X now for a while. It used to be called
no.
Twitter. Trying to stay up to date
Until
on
next week,
yeah,
or
until
the week
next week,
after,
whatever
or whatever.
Elon Musk decides. But thank you so much. Is there anything
Oh,
you'd like to leave our audience with other than they need to watch and listen to Orphan Black, which
watch
is
and listen to
obvious at this point?
Black. Pay attention to all of us. I guess like my funny story about Orphan Black. I have two funny stories about Orphan
Yeah,
Black.
please.
One is that I live near one of the filming locations, and so like
Really?
the first time I saw it on screen, I was like, they were it was just like, and it's a very made in Toronto moment, like that happens more often than not. It happens on Star Trek Discovery, it happens on the boy, or not Discovery, it happens on not Discovery,
I
Brave
don't
New
know
World,
Star Trek enough. I know
Strange New
Star
World,
Wars.
Strange New
Okay.
World. It's the end of the day, I've been talking too much. It
Yes.
happens on Strange New Worlds, it happens on The Boys, it happened on Orphan Black, it happens on a bunch of shows, Titans, like uh all the most recent Guillermo del Toro films. Like there's a huge filmmaking community out here, and a lot
Yeah.
of stuff gets made out here, and so like it's always like really fun when you spot a landmark on Orphan Black or any other show.
Yeah. I
um
do that with New York a lot. I'm like, oh my God,
yeah,
I've been there as if it's
I've been
not
there,
like the
I've
most
been there.
populated city. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and you're like, yeah. And then so that in itself is fun, but the actual like, long before like I was ever tapped to be like involved with the show in any way, shape, or form, I actually took a flight from Toronto to San Diego for Comic-Con in 2016 with almost the entire cast, like completely
Oh
by,
my God, I would have freaked out.
yeah, like
What?
completely by accident.
I mean, I guess it makes sense. You're going to
we're all flying
Comic-Con.
from
Everyone
Toronto
is
to
doing the same flight for that
everybody's going to the
timing.
same place. Everybody's going to the show. And it was the
Wow.
weekend. It was the time like when there are certain flights that are obviously Comic-Con flights, and you know immediately when you are amongst your own people.
I should
And
just do that for fun, even if I'm not going to
it's
Comic-Con.
it's a trip. Like
Wow.
and what San Diego is beautiful, but like I'd never been to the show before. I was really nervous.
And you
And
spoke there, right? Was that the
I
time you
did, yeah.
spoke?
I
Or
spoke
yeah,
on a
because
couple of
I
different
saw that when I was doing a
panels
little research. Yeah.
and stuff. Um, I so I was already, and I'd read like God, it was like 10 books in 14 days or like something like that, or like 9 books in 10 days or something, because I was a moderator, so I'd been given a bunch of books to read from the authors that I was moderating, so I was just like
Ah.
and I was staying with Victoria Schwab, and like I was like had loved her books and like all these different things, and so like my brain was like already full, and then I noticed that I was like, oh, I know that guy. I know that guy too.
Oh my
I
God. Are
know
you just
her.
walking by
Like it was
first
a real
class? Like, wait a
kind of
minute.
an eerie moment of like being on the plane and being like, this is happening,
Oh
and
my God.
stuff, because I think they were all in first, and I was not, most emphatically not. And but we all had to stand together at baggage claim,
Oh my God.
and it was the eerie. I don't want to say it was eerie because like nothing about it was scary. What
Right.
was
But it's
I
surreal.
was probably scaring to them because I just kept like grinning like a fool,
Yep.
and
That
like
would have been me.
yeah, like, and I was just like, it was on the cusp to be like, oh, I love that show. And then I was like, no, no, no. They have like an entire weekend of that.
Yep. They're
Um,
just getting started with all the
like
fans
do
and
not start the process now. Like, don't be that
oh
person.
my God.
And stuff. And most of the time that I've ever seen celebrities, which is often on planes actually, or like
I got to fly to Toronto more. Dang.
well, one time I was in Los Angeles, and I was crossing at I was in Hancock Park, and I was crossing at Rosewood and Rossmore, and like Tilda Swinton came by. Like she stopped at the thing, and it was when her hair was really bleached because she had done the video with David Bowie.
Oh,
And
okay.
and so like one, you saw this woman who like had very bleached hair, so like
Right.
you
Totally
knew her
stands
right
out.
away.
Yeah.
And like I was the only person on the sidewalk, and I looked at her, and there was this moment where she looks at me like, I know that you know me.
Yep.
And I was like, I'm gonna keep walking. I'm not gonna make it weird.
She
Like,
probably appreciated that in the moment.
you know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I
Wow.
swear this is not gonna go badly. Um, I once ran into Tom Selleck on a plane, and like there was this
Whoa.
part of me that like uh because I knew him, like Magnum PI was on when I was a child, and
Hmm.
I like just literally, it was so silly. I passed by him and like walking through first class, and I saw him there, like wearing tiny shorts in the middle of the winter, and and he's hugely tall, and I was,
Yeah.
oh hey, and he nodded at me like he also knew me,
As if you're like, hey, what's up,
and
Tom?
I was like, hey, and he's like, hey, and I just kept going
That is so
because
funny.
I was like, that was mortifying. Why did I do that?
Yeah, I've definitely done some weird my only that I can think of celebrity thing was Jake Gyllenhaal and his sister, Maggie
Oh
Gyllenhaal.
wow.
They were walking. I was in the city in New York City, and I forget what Parker ranks. Embarrassingly, should know the city better than I do. Living in there for a little bit. I walked by them, and I noticed it was them right as they were walking by, but I didn't want to say anything to the friends I was with. But I said a moment later, "Hey, look," and then made a joke about, oh, it's the red scarf. Where's that of the Taylor
Where's your
Swift song? And
scarf? Where's
like, oh, you left it at your sister's place, in
I
that drawer.
wonder if he like,
Um,
if I were Jake Gyllenhaal, I would just like have not left my apartment
Well,
for like,
also like to be walking with your sister, you're both very well
yes,
known. So like that
yeah,
was
who's
that was
yeah,
interesting, but didn't
no,
say
yeah,
anything because I
yeah,
couldn't think
no,
of anything in the moment, and I don't
no.
want to give him privacy, but
I had a
wow.
Toronto moment like that years and years and years ago with Rachel McAdams, where I was standing
Oh.
and I was on an escalator coming out of the subway, and I was standing behind this woman, and I was like, wow, she really looks like Rachel McAdams. And then like I go the other way, and I'm like, you're an idiot.
Right,
Like
like actually
I
that
was like,
was.
it was like that was her. That was like, so
Wow.
it was just very like, because she lived here for a while. I don't know if she's
Oh,
still,
okay.
but
Yeah.
the you never know who's going to be in town. Um, you know, w- Matt Berry from What We Do in the Shadows showed up at like will sometimes show up at different concerts and do like
That's
singing.
cool.
He did that recently. Like it's a because of the productions, which I think now many of them are also struck.
Yeah.
The like there was a real sense of like you don't know who you'll run into. You never know
Right. No,
city
but
or
in
what city.
Canada, it's Vancouver or Toronto. Those are the two filming
Yeah,
spots. So
no.
yeah.
It's so it is like it is always really interesting and it does give you sort of more of a understanding of um the actors as people and like what
Yeah.
everyone's up against and what it takes to do a show and even on
That's a
in
lot.
audio that's true like
Yeah.
a lot of it turned out to be the same so
Yeah.
it's
No.
fascinating to me.
Yeah, that is very, very cool. And I just thank you so much for creating such an amazing podcast. I mean, I'll probably have to give it another year, but then I'll do a whole run through again, I think, because it was
Yeah.
just so
Well,
good.
have us back,
Yes.
ask Malka like how this all got started
I would love
for like
any
more.
intros you have.
And
I would
for she
love.
probably has more information.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it was a wonderful time and like taught me so much about working on a team. Like working on it, like writers do not always get that chance.
Hmm.
And and especially a team made of so many women. Like that also almost never happened. So it was really fascinating to be able to do that. It was a huge, huge privilege and then to get the caliber of these people like
Yeah. Oh,
reading.
the actors, actresses are
Yeah.
phenomenal. I mean, they're just, I think people will look back and be like, oh, they got their start on Orphan Black, like almost Freaks and Geeks. Everybody from that show became
Yes, yeah,
huge.
it was like that. Like it really like brought in a lot of people who
Yeah.
like it granted a huge amount of attention a um it was like it is a star making vehicle. It was really a star
Yeah.
making vehicle
Yeah.
for not just Tatiana, but for lots of people. I mean, like I think it definitely led to her getting She-Hulk and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Oh,
Because
definitely. Cause she got to really show off her talents. Yeah.
the physical requirements are very similar
Yeah.
uh in terms of what your day looks like. And so there are really only a few people who can do it.
Right.
And
Of like those long shoots. Cause one scene takes so long when you're playing six characters. It's like, yeah.
yes, like your day is like hour-long drama shoots are typically like 16-hour days on good days,
Right.
or between 12 and 16-hour days on good days. And like to the point where like one of the reasons that IATSE has been like so vocal about this strike and the possibility of their striking in the past was that
Yeah.
like things were happening like where crew who had been on set even longer than the actors were getting into accidents on the way home because they were literally falling asleep at the wheel.
I have seen people be quotes about that. It's just
Yeah.
terrible. It's like
So
we need these standards. We
yeah,
need.
you need the standards. The same
Yeah.
as I would say, weirdly, it is like science. You need a clean lab.
Yes. Yep.
You need people who are not dead on their feet. You need people who understand basic safety. And there have to be things in place if you break those rules. Like the
Yeah.
same as when you're conducting an experiment or operating in a clean room or like trying to do new things because that's where science and art are the same, right? Like we're both here trying to do something new and
Right.
find something new and make a discovery and share it with people.
Yeah.
And
I never thought about those parallels. It's very interesting. Yeah.
and and in order to do the best work possible in those places, you have to be willing to like, play on a team,
Mm-hmm.
and follow some rules and respect your fellow players and bring the best like you can't bring your best self to an environment that isn't the best for you
No,
and
it's
I
got
think
to be a
that's what.
fostering, collaborative environment where you're really like, especially with these are very challenging
Oh yeah. Oh,
like circumstances that actors are
awful.
going through. Like, I'm tired. I get home from my clinic job, meeting with patients
Yeah.
and talking all day. And, but it's like my day's over in 8 hours, right? Like then I come
Well,
home and do fun stuff like this.
but I
So,
think like scientists are up against similar tensions where it's like
Yeah.
there's diminishing funding, there's like there
Long
only
days in
certain
the lab
people.
of, this experiment takes this many hours. I can't leave. Yeah.
Yeah, or like crunching, like getting access to the devices that can actually crunch the numbers, or getting
Yep.
like, which is essentially effects equipment, like getting access to enough support staff, getting access to all that, like even being sort of having your work taken seriously, like, or like being told again and again, like, oh, well, there's no growth there, or like, oh, there's no, people aren't interested in that. Like the same things that I think that researchers hear is what is being said to creatives. Like that's where I think
Mm-hmm.
like I had a very multidisciplinary education, and I think that the forces at play that suppress both discoveries at both levels are about like, you know, wanting, in a lot of ways, wanting to kill a team spirit,
Yeah.
and so I think like that's where those conversations are not as different as everyone might imagine, because I deal
Yeah.
with both crowds
Right.
in
You're
my
seeing
job,
that
so
Venn
I hear the
diagram. You're in the
same
middle.
complaints.
You're like,
I
you guys
hear
should be
the
in a
same
support group
complaints.
together. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, you don't know this, but this sounds very familiar.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Madeline, for coming on. Everybody, you have to check out Orphan Black, the next chapter. And you really got to watch the TV show because it picks up not right where we leave off, but I think a couple years into the future kind of
Yeah,
thing. So
it's a good 2 or 3 years or something
yeah.
like that.
So you
It's
want to enjoy the
yeah,
full start to
yeah,
finish of everything because
yeah,
it is just fabulous. And if you watch it and you need someone to nerd out about it, just email me because I
yeah.
love talking about Orphan Black.
You should
So,
do like a rewatching club for your listeners.
we have a Patreon club. I feel like this should
You
be an
should do
upcoming
that.
thing. Yes,
You should do that, and like
wow, boom, that has to happen.
that's the
And maybe we need a guest appearance from you at some point.
I would
That would
happily
be
do that,
amazing.
especially when you
Amazing.
get to the podcast episode
Right.
involving.
Yes. Yeah. Then that's awesome. Well, thank you
Yes.
so much for just nerding out with me. This was
Oh, no.
awesome. I mean, this was 10 years in the making in my mind because I started
Oh,
watching it in 2013, when I was just starting college. So it was, it's 10 years old.
good Lord, yeah.
So yeah, it's crazy. I'll have to look up when the first episode actually came out because maybe we haven't actually hit the anniversary yet.
We may not have done. I
Yeah, I'll
can't
have to look it
tell.
up. Maybe this episode will come out for the anniversary. Who knows?
No, because I think it was a fall show. I think it was
Oh,
a
perfect. That
a
makes
big fall
sense.
show. I want to
Yeah.
say
I
it
think it
came
was
out.
as I was starting college. So yeah.
Yeah, I want to say it was a big, because like you obviously don't live in Toronto, but like
No, but one of my best
yeah,
friends does. So yeah.
like
Yeah.
we saw that like the Clone Club
Mm-hmm.
was
Woo!
on every subway.
That is
They
dope.
were
Oh, and
on. They
another
were
thing I have to say for people
everywhere.
listening, if you're going to the genetics conference, ACMG, I think, it's going to be in Toronto in March of 2024. So
Oh,
got
no
to watch
way.
the show beforehand, listeners, so that then you can check out the sites because, I'm hoping to attend. We'll see. And, maybe crash with my best friend. So, Miranda. But yeah, so, I mean, yeah, that's definitely, you gotta get it in now. You have time to
And
watch it now.
see the sites. See
Yeah.
see where
It all
see where
came to
everything
be.
gets made.
Yeah, definitely.
And stuff, and yeah, like it's a great time, and March is
We
actually
still
now
got like 9 months. Yeah, something like that.
yeah, it's never as far away as you think.
I know, right?
And
It's like, oh, I
actually
don't need to book flights.
yeah, actually it's not as intemperate as it used to be because of climate change.
Yeah,
So
that is
like
true. I went in January and I survived. So,
yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely. Well, thank you again so much.
No, thank you.
Thanks for watching DNA Today. To access all of our episodes, head over to dnatoday.com. We also have a lot of bonus content on there that you can enjoy. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, guest pitches, you name it, send them in to info@dnatoday.com. We'd also really appreciate if you could take a moment to rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to the show. It really helps more nerds like yourself find the show. Also, if you like giveaways and other ways to connect with us, I recommend following us on social. We're at DNA Today Podcast. We also have a Patreon if you want to be the most level involved in the show. That's also at DNA Today Podcast. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Join us next time to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.